Hello and welcome to part 3 of our Python tutorial series. Today we're going to discuss what is a function. Okay. Now we're going to break this up into 3 parts. The first part we're going to define what is a function. Second part we're going to go over how to make a function. And lastly we're going to discuss how to handle some errors dealing with our functions. Okay. So to begin, what is a function? Okay. We see some examples here. We're given some information and we see on the right hand side we get a short definition that says a function is a fragment of code that we can use several times, at however many times we want. We could keep calling our function. We'll discuss what that means later on. But more specifically, a function we can think of as a block of code that receives data and performs some operation on this data and then returns some data back to us. Okay, and we've already seen examples of a function already, and this is our print method right here in line 5. And remember, a method and a function, those words are used interchangeably, okay, referring to the same thing. And we already have some experience with one function already, which is the print function. And we saw what the print function did. We passed in a message in a string, or we could pass in some numbers, and it just displays that into the console. Okay. So that's a broad view of a function. Is a block of code that accepts some data and returns some data after performing some manipulation to the data that it received. Okay, so that covers what is a function. Now we can go over how to make a function. Okay, so now that we know the purpose, now let's go over how to actually make one. Okay, and we see in our example, in our question 3 here, we already provided a defined function. And first thing we need to go over is the def keyword. Okay, the def keyword stands for define, and it's Python's keyword that recognizes that we're about to make a function. Okay, the next part is now we get to name our function. Okay, in this case we name our function sum, so we have an idea of what this function is going to do. Okay, just like our print function printed out data to the screen, to the console here, we're going to name our function based on what it's expected to do. Okay. Now, perhaps the most important part is what you see here. We open up our parentheses right after our function name, and we pass in what's called parameters. Okay. Now, parameters is where the data is coming in from. Okay. So for example, in this case, we're calling our sum function, and we're going to go over what calling means in a little bit. But we're passing in this number 2, and we're passing in this number 3. Okay. We're able to do that because when we defined our function in line 1, we defined it as having 2 parameters, and we see that they're separated by comma. Okay. You can have any number of parameters. You can have from 0 to as many as you want. They're all going to be separated by comma. Okay. Here we have 2 parameters, and we name them num1 and num2. That just means that our function is going to accept 2 pieces of data. Okay. And a couple more parts here that we need to create our function. We see we have this colon here. After the colon, we want to hit enter, and we see that we automatically get indented inside of the function. This is Python syntax, which is just a way of how Python was designed, that we need to indent after we create a function, and everything that's indented in here is code that is contained inside of the sum function. Okay, so for example, if we had this, we see that we're getting errors already. So we get this underlined squiggly. You see the error, it says expected and indented block. Okay. So remember, when you're creating your Python functions, make sure to indent. And now everything inside of here, so if I have more lines, we want to be indented inside of our function definition. Okay. The last important part here is the return keyword. Remember, when we defined what a function is, it takes some data in, performs some operation on this data, and it returns back this data to us. Okay, so if we look in line 2, we're returning the sum of our first parameter plus our second parameter. Okay, so it's a couple main points when we're defining our function. One, we need a def keyword to define our function, the name of our function, and we need to open up our parentheses and determine if this function needs any data to be received. Okay, and again, that depends on the problem that we're working with. Okay. Once we are established with our parameters, then we close it off with our colon, and now we're able to indent inside the body of our function. In this case, we're returning the sum of the two parameters that we just defined. Okay. So now moving on to line 5. Now let's go over what calling our function means. We see that calling a function just means that we're just typing out the function name, and we're opening up our parentheses, and we're passing in the exact number of parameters that were defined. We see that our function, when we defined our function, we said that it needs two parameters, right? Two pieces of data. So when we call our function, meaning just type it out, we're passing in our two data. We're passing in 2, and we're passing in 3, right? We're passing in two pieces of data. So based on the function definition, we know it's just going to return the sum of num1 plus num2. So we know that's going to return 2 plus 3. Okay, and order matters here. So 2 is now represented by number 1, and 3 is now represented by number 2. Okay, and we're returning the sum of these two numbers. So 2 plus 3, we know that's 5, and that's getting assigned to our variable total. Okay, so that brings us to our next important point, that we can call a function and we can assign the result to a variable. Okay, so now our variable total contains 5. Okay, because we called our sum function that returns the sum of the two pieces of data that we passed in. Okay, and the last thing we're doing here is we are printing out the total, which we know will be 5. So if I compile this, you see that we get 5, and we know that our print method from our previous example just takes in some data and displays it onto our console. Okay, so now let's look at the question. We have some instructions here where it says, please calculate the sum between this large number and another large number, and let's assign the result to a variable called super duper. Okay, so since we already have our sum function defined, we just need to pass in these two pieces of data and assign the result to a variable called super duper. Okay, in this case, we're assigning the result to a variable called sum. So we can go ahead and change the variable to super duper, like the instructions wanted. And we will no longer be printing total. We will now be printing our variable super duper is going to contain the sum of these two numbers that we're getting executed from our sum function. So let's pass in the numbers 344, 5324. and the second large number, which is 53454423. Okay, let's double check. 442. Okay, so let's compile, and we see we get printed out on the console now a large number. And now let's run our test case, and we see that everything was expected, and our code here passed the test case for our question here. So far we covered what is a function, and we covered how to make a function. Okay, now I would like to discuss some common errors that you will see. One is if we don't pass in the right number of parameters to our function. We see that when we define our function, it needs 2 pieces of data. So when we call our function, we need to pass in the correct number of data. If we don't, let's say we just, by accident, just pass in one number, even though when we defined our function, it needs 2 pieces of data. If we compile now, we see that we get an error, and we actually get back in our console here, in our terminal, that the sum method is missing one required positional argument. Okay, so it's telling us the error. It's telling us this is wrong. Our sum function needs another parameter. Okay, so let's put back our data. So now we're calling our function correctly, and everything's going as expected. One last thing to point out here is our function only executes when we call our function. So right here, we are calling our sum function. Okay. When we call our sum function, that's the only time it executes. Okay. So for example, if I commented out this line, then our function is not going to run. Okay. We need to call our function, pass in the proper amount of data, and that is the only way our function will ever execute, is if we call it. Okay. So that wraps up the example for this question, and we're going to move on to question 4.